The name Genghis Khan echoes through history like a thunderclap, conjuring images of vast empires and legendary conquests. But beneath the veneer of strategic brilliance and military prowess lies a darkness so profound that entire civilizations trembled at the mere mention of his approach. This is not the sanitized tale of a great unifier, but the blood-soaked reality of a man who built the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever seen upon mountains of corpses and rivers of tears. What you are about to hear are the documented atrocities that defined his reign, the horrific methods that ensured his dominance, and the incomprehensible suffering inflicted upon millions in the pursuit of absolute power. In the late 12th century, the Mongol steppes were a harsh and unforgiving landscape where survival meant constant warfare between nomadic tribes. Born as Temujin around 1162, the future Genghis Khan emerged from this brutal environment, shaped by betrayal, slavery, and the murder of his father. The Mongol society of this era valued strength above all else, and mercy was seen not as virtue, but as fatal weakness. Intertribal raids were commonplace, with defeated enemies often slaughtered to prevent future retaliation. This was the crucible that forged Genghis Khan's worldview, one in which total domination was the only path to security, and terror was the most efficient tool of governance. By 1206, Temujin had united the fractious Mongol tribes under his leadership and taken the title Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler. His ambitions, however, extended far beyond the steppes. He envisioned an empire that would stretch from the Pacific Ocean to the heart of Europe, and he possessed both the military genius and the ruthless determination to achieve it. The Mongol military machine he created was revolutionary in its organization, discipline, and tactical sophistication. Divided into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, his armies moved with unprecedented speed and coordination. But it was not merely military superiority that allowed the Mongols to conquer vast territories. It was the systematic use of psychological warfare and deliberate atrocity that broke the will of his enemies before a single arrow was fired. Genghis Khan understood that resistance was expensive in both time and Mongol lives, resources he could not afford to waste. Therefore, he developed a doctrine of exemplary violence, a calculated policy designed to encourage immediate surrender. Cities that opened their gates would be spared, their populations absorbed into the growing empire, but those who dared to resist faced annihilation so complete that neighboring cities would capitulate without a fight. This was not the random savagery of undisciplined warriors, but a coldly rational strategy executed with industrial efficiency. The horror was the point, a message written in blood and ash that would be read across continents. The first major test of this doctrine came with the campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire, one of the most powerful states in Central Asia. In 1218, Genghis Khan had sent a trade caravan of several hundred merchants to establish commercial relations. The governor of the border city of Otrar, suspecting the merchants were spies, had them arrested and executed, confiscating their valuable goods. When Genghis Khan demanded justice and the extradition of the governor, the Khwarezm Shah not only refused, but executed the Mongol ambassador and humiliated the remaining envoys. This insult ignited a campaign of retribution that would become legendary for its savagery and leave entire regions depopulated for generations. In 1219, Genghis Khan mobilized an army estimated at between 100,000 and 200,000 warriors and invaded the Khwarezmian Empire. The Mongol strategy was methodical and terrifying in its execution. They bypassed heavily fortified positions, struck at vulnerable points, and used superior intelligence gathering to exploit weaknesses in enemy defenses. City after city fell, each providing a grim lesson to those who might consider resistance. The siege techniques employed by the Mongols were sophisticated for their time. incorporating Chinese engineering expertise, and captured specialists who built siege engines, catapults, and other devices of destruction. But the true horror began not during the sieges themselves, but in the aftermath of conquest. When a city resisted, Genghis Khan's response was systematic extermination. The population would be herded into open fields outside the city walls, where they would be divided by age, gender, and skill. Artisans, craftsmen, and young women might be spared for slavery or forced labor. Everyone else faced execution. The methods varied, but the results were always the same: mass death on a scale that defies comprehension. Soldiers would be assigned quotas, each required to execute a certain number of civilians. Historical accounts from Persian chroniclers describe Mongol warriors methodically working through crowds of prisoners, beheading them with practiced efficiency. Some sources claim that to ensure accuracy in body counts, soldiers were required to cut off an ear from each corpse and present them in sacks to their commanders. The psychological impact of these massacres cannot be overstated. Survivors, when any were deliberately left alive, would flee to neighboring cities carrying tales of the Mongol atrocities. These testimonies served as powerful propaganda, spreading panic ahead of the advancing armies. Intelligence networks cultivated by the Mongols ensured that exaggerated accounts of their cruelty reached enemy populations, softening resistance before the siege began. This was warfare not just against armies, but against the collective psyche of entire civilizations. Fear became a weapon as devastating as any sword or arrow, and Genghis Khan wielded it with masterful precision. The city of Bukhara, one of the great centers of Islamic learning and culture, fell to the Mongols in 1220. When the citadel's defenders refused to surrender after the city's outer walls had been breached, Genghis Khan ordered the civilian population to fill the moat surrounding the fortress, using the living and the dead alike as construction material. Eyewitness accounts describe thousands of people being driven forward under threat of death, forced to carry earth and rubble until they collapsed from exhaustion or were struck down by arrows from the defenders above. The moat was eventually filled with a mixture of soil, stones, and human bodies, creating a grotesque ramp over which the Mongol forces advanced. Those who survived this ordeal faced enslavement, forced labor, or execution, depending on their perceived usefulness. After Bukhara's fall, Genghis Khan entered the Great Mosque and, according to the historian Juvaini, who recorded eyewitness accounts, addressed the assembled nobles and religious leaders. He declared that he was the punishment of God, sent to chastise them for their sins. The city was then systematically looted, its libraries containing irreplaceable manuscripts were burned, and its population subjected to mass rape and murder. Young women were distributed among the soldiers as spoils of war, while men were either killed or pressed into service as human shields in subsequent campaigns. The cultural and intellectual devastation was immense. Centuries of accumulated knowledge and artistic achievement were destroyed in a matter of days. The treatment of Bukhara set a template that would be repeated across the Khwarezmian Empire. Samarkand, another jewel of Central Asian civilization, surrendered after only 5 days of siege, having heard of Bukhara's fate. Despite their capitulation, the population was not spared entirely. Genghis Khan demanded that 30,000 skilled artisans be separated from the general population and sent east to Mongolia and China. Another 30,000 young men were conscripted into the Mongol army, to be used as expendable shock troops in future battles. The remaining population, estimated at over 100,000, was marched outside the city walls. There, they were executed en masse, their bodies left to rot as a warning to any who might consider resistance. The fall of Samarkand demonstrated another aspect of Mongol military innovation: the use of human shields. Prisoners from conquered cities were driven ahead of advancing Mongol forces during sieges, forcing defenders to kill their own people if they wished to resist. This tactic was both practical and psychological. It provided cover for advancing troops while simultaneously breaking the morale of defenders who found themselves inadvertently slaughtering their neighbors, friends, and family members. Contemporary sources describe the anguish of besieged populations who watched helplessly as their loved ones were forced to approach city walls, often carrying siege equipment or filling defensive ditches with their own bodies. The city of Nishapur would experience perhaps the most complete and methodical massacre in the entire campaign. The city had killed Tokuchar, a son-in-law of Genghis Khan, during an earlier siege attempt in 1220. When the Mongols returned in 1221, Tokuchar's widow personally oversaw the siege, demanding absolute vengeance. After the city fell, she ordered that every living thing within the walls be killed: men, women, children, and even cats and dogs. The execution took several days to complete. According to the Persian historian Juzjani, the city's population of perhaps 1.7 million was reduced to zero. Even allowing for historical exaggeration, modern scholars estimate that hundreds of thousands died in Nishapur. The methodology of the Nishapur massacre was particularly systematic. The population was herded into the plain outside the city, where they were arranged in groups. Mongol soldiers then moved through these groups with swords and axes, executing every person they encountered. To ensure completeness, heads were separated from bodies and arranged in pyramids. One of men, one of women, one of children. These macabre monuments served as both body count verification and psychological warfare, visible from great distances to refugees and scouts from other cities. The pyramids of skulls would become a signature of Mongol conquest, repeated in city after city across Asia and Eastern Europe. The destruction of Nishapur extended beyond human life. Buildings were razed to their foundations, irrigation systems destroyed, and agricultural lands deliberately salted or flooded to prevent recovery. The goal was not merely to defeat the city, but to erase it from existence, to ensure that it could never again pose a threat or even serve as a center of potential resistance. This scorched earth policy was applied selectively, targeting cities that had offered particularly stubborn resistance, or, as in Nishapur's case, had killed someone of importance to Genghis Khan. The message was clear. Submission might bring survival, but defiance brought obliteration so complete that future generations would find only ruins and bones. The psychological toll on survivors in the region was profound. Entire communities were traumatized, their social structures shattered, their populations decimated. Those who escaped the massacres became refugees, spreading across Central Asia and the Middle East, carrying with them tales of horror that grew with each retelling. The economic impact was equally devastating. These cities had been vital nodes in the Silk Road trade network, and their destruction disrupted commerce across the known world. It would take decades, in some cases centuries, for these regions to recover economically and demographically from the Mongol invasions. The city of Merv, one of the largest and most prosperous cities in the world at that time, met a fate similar to Nishapur. Historical accounts suggest its population may have numbered between 500,000 and 1 million people. When the city surrendered in 1221 after a brief siege, the inhabitants were promised mercy if they emerged peacefully. They complied, gathering in the plains outside the city walls. What followed was one of the largest single massacres in human history. Over the course of several days, Mongol soldiers systematically executed the entire population. The historian Ibn al-Athir, writing shortly after the events, claimed that each Mongol soldier was assigned to kill between 300 and 400 people. The logistics of such large-scale killing are almost incomprehensible. To execute hundreds of thousands of people requires organization, time, and a complete suppression of normal human empathy. The Mongol military culture had been deliberately constructed to facilitate exactly this kind of mass atrocity. From childhood, warriors were trained to view enemies not as fellow humans, but as obstacles to be removed. Discipline was absolute. Orders to kill were carried out without question or hesitation. Those who showed mercy or failed to meet their execution quotas faced severe punishment, including death. This created a military machine capable of functioning as an instrument of genocide, efficient and remorseless. The aftermath of Merv's destruction haunted the region for generations. When Tolui, one of Genghis Khan's sons, who had commanded the siege, learned that some residents had hidden among the corpses and survived, he sent troops back to search through the bodies and kill any survivors. Birds of prey and wild dogs feasted on the remains for months. The stench of decay was reportedly detectable from miles away. Travelers who passed through the area in subsequent years described fields of bones stretching to the horizon, a testament to the scale of the slaughter. The city itself was so thoroughly destroyed that it never fully recovered its former prominence, and the population of the surrounding region remained depressed for over a century. The terror tactics employed by Genghis Khan were not limited to mass executions. Public displays of cruelty served to reinforce the message that resistance was not merely futile, but would result in suffering beyond imagination. Captured enemy leaders, particularly those who had defied the Mongols or killed Mongol envoys, faced elaborate and prolonged deaths designed to maximize suffering and humiliation. These executions were often conducted publicly, with surviving populations forced to watch as their former rulers were tormented. The psychological impact was profound, breaking the spirit of resistance and ensuring that future encounters with Mongol forces would be met with immediate capitulation. One documented form of execution reserved for particularly hated enemies was death by molten metal. When the city of Otrar finally fell after a 5-month siege in 1220, the governor who had executed Genghis Khan's merchants and sparked the entire campaign was captured alive. According to multiple historical sources, molten silver was poured into his eyes and ears, a symbolic punishment reflecting his refusal to see the value of the merchants or hear Genghis Khan's demands for justice. Whether this account is literally true or represents a symbolic description of his fate, it circulated widely and contributed to the Mongols' reputation for inventive and theatrical cruelty. Other high-ranking captives faced different but equally horrific fates. Some were sewn into carpets or leather sacks and then trampled to death by horses, a method that technically avoided shedding noble blood while still ensuring a brutal death. This practice, rooted in Central Asian traditions regarding the treatment of royal prisoners, was employed by Genghis Khan as both execution and political theater. The bound prisoners would be placed in open areas where troops and sometimes civilian populations could witness their suffering as hundreds of horses were driven over them repeatedly until they were crushed to death. The slow, agonizing nature of this execution served as a powerful deterrent. Genghis Khan also employed psychological torture and humiliation to break the will of enemy populations. Captured religious leaders, who held significant social and moral authority, were sometimes forced to commit sacrilegious acts before being executed. This served the dual purpose of demoralization and demonstrating that the Mongols recognized no authority higher than their own. In Islamic cities, imams might be forced to drink alcohol or destroy copies of the Quran. In Buddhist regions, monks could be compelled to eat meat or destroy religious artifacts. These forced violations of deeply held beliefs were designed to shatter the spiritual foundations of conquered societies, leaving populations more compliant and easier to control. The treatment of women during Mongol conquests deserves particular attention, as it represents another dimension of the systematic terror employed by Genghis Khan. Mass rape was a standard component of Mongol military campaigns, serving multiple purposes within their strategic framework. It demoralized enemy populations, provided rewards for soldiers, and over time contributed to the genetic legacy that Genghis Khan would leave across Asia. The scale of sexual violence during these campaigns was staggering. When cities fell, women were rounded up and distributed among the soldiers according to rank and merit. Resistance was met with immediate death, often of the woman and her entire family. The systematic nature of this sexual violence cannot be overstated. It was not the chaotic assault of undisciplined troops, but an organized process of distribution and exploitation. Young, attractive women were often reserved for commanders and the Khan himself, while others were given to common soldiers. Some women were kept as concubines, others were forced into temporary marriages that lasted only as long as the army remained in the region. When the Mongols moved on to their next conquest, these women were frequently abandoned, left pregnant and ostracized by their own communities, which often viewed them as contaminated or dishonored. The psychological and social destruction this caused rippled through generations. Contemporary accounts from Persian and Chinese sources describe the anguish of families who watched as their daughters and wives were taken, knowing that resistance meant death for everyone. Some families chose collective suicide rather than face this fate. Others were forced to witness the assault of their loved ones as a form of psychological torture before being executed themselves. The trauma inflicted on surviving populations was profound and lasting. In some cases, entire social structures collapsed under the weight of this collective trauma, as traditional family bonds and community cohesion were shattered by the systematic sexual violence. The genetic legacy of these mass rapes is still visible today. Modern genetic studies have found that a significant percentage of men in regions once conquered by the Mongols share a common Y chromosome lineage that traces back to Central Asia during the period of Mongol expansion. Some researchers have suggested that as many as 16 million men alive today, roughly 0.5% of the world's male population, are direct line descendants of Genghis Khan. This staggering figure, if accurate, represents not a celebration of conquest, but a biological testament to systematic sexual violence on a scale rarely seen in human history. Each of those descendants represents an ancestral line that began with rape, enslavement, or coerced concubinage during the Mongol conquests. The Mongols' use of prisoners as human shields and expendable labor represents another category of atrocity that defined their campaigns. After conquering a city, able-bodied men who were not immediately executed were often conscripted into forced labor battalions. These prisoners were used in the most dangerous aspects of warfare, filling moats, constructing siege equipment, and serving as the first wave in assaults on fortified positions. They were expendable assets, driven forward at sword point, with Mongol cavalry positioned behind them to cut down any who attempted to flee. Death rates among these forced laborers were astronomical, often approaching 100% over the course of a campaign. The psychological torture of being forced to attack one's own people was an additional layer of cruelty in this system. Prisoners from one city would be driven to assault the walls of the next, forcing defenders to kill their own countrymen, neighbors, and sometimes relatives. This created impossible moral dilemmas for those defending cities. Should they refuse to fight and allow the Mongols to breach their walls? Or should they kill the prisoners being used as shields, understanding that these people were victims, but that allowing them to advance meant the city's fall and potentially even greater massacres? The Mongols exploited these moral quandaries ruthlessly, understanding that psychological anguish could be as effective as physical violence in breaking resistance. The use of human shields also had a practical military purpose beyond psychological warfare. It conserved Mongol lives during the most dangerous phase of siege warfare, the approach to and assault on city walls. Arrows, boiling oil, and dropped stones from defenders would strike prisoners first, allowing Mongol forces to advance with reduced casualties. In some cases, prisoners were forced to carry scaling ladders or push siege towers, absorbing defensive fire while Mongol soldiers followed in relative safety. After an assault, Whether successful or not, the surviving prisoners who had been forced to participate were typically executed, as they had outlived their usefulness, and feeding them represented an unnecessary expense. Contemporary accounts describe the despair of these forced laborers, who understood they were doomed whether they advanced or retreated, whether their side won or lost. Some prisoners chose to make futile attacks on their Mongol captors, accepting immediate death rather than prolonged suffering and the guilt of potentially contributing to their homeland's destruction. Others went mad under the psychological strain, and their disturbed behavior was sometimes used by the Mongols as an additional form of psychological warfare, with these traumatized individuals driven towards city walls where their obvious distress could be seen by defenders, further eroding morale. The Mongol campaign against the Jin dynasty in northern China, which lasted from 1211 to 1234, demonstrated the full spectrum of Genghis Khan's brutal methodology on an even larger scale than the Central Asian conquests. The Jin Empire was one of the most populous and developed civilizations of its time, with sophisticated cities, advanced agricultural systems, and a powerful military. Yet it too fell before the Mongol onslaught, losing millions of people in the process. The tactics employed were the same that had proven effective in Central Asia: rapid cavalry movements, superior intelligence, psychological warfare, and the systematic use of atrocity to encourage surrender. The siege of Beijing, then called Zhongdu in 1215, exemplified the horrors of Mongol siege warfare. The city, with a population estimated at over 1 million, was surrounded by massive walls and well defended. The siege lasted months, during which time the defenders and civilian population began to starve. The Mongols, showing characteristic patience when faced with strong fortifications, simply waited. They had learned from earlier campaigns that time was often their greatest ally when facing fortified cities. Starvation would accomplish what assault might achieve only at great cost in Mongol lives. As food ran out inside Beijing, reports emerged of cannibalism among the desperate population, with the dead being consumed by the dying in a futile effort to survive just a little longer. When Beijing finally fell, whether through negotiated surrender or final assault, accounts differ. The Mongols entered a city already transformed into a charnel house by months of starvation and disease. What followed was systematic looting and slaughter. The imperial palaces were stripped of their treasures, libraries containing irreplaceable texts were burned, and a significant portion of the surviving population was killed. Artisans and skilled workers were identified and separated for forced relocation to Mongolia, where they would spend the rest of their lives as slaves, producing goods for their conquerors. The infrastructure of the city, including its sophisticated water systems and public buildings, was deliberately damaged to prevent it from serving as a power base for future resistance. The environmental and demographic consequences of the Mongol conquests in northern China were catastrophic. Agricultural lands were converted to pasture for Mongol horses, as the conquerors had little understanding or appreciation of settled agriculture. Irrigation systems that had taken centuries to develop were abandoned or destroyed, leading to crop failures and famine. The population of northern China, which had been estimated at over 50 million before the Mongol invasion, dropped to perhaps 9 million by the time Mongol rule was consolidated. While some of this decline can be attributed to disease and the disruptions of war, a substantial portion represents deliberate killing, death from starvation due to the destruction of agricultural infrastructure, and refugees fleeing south into territories not yet conquered by the Mongols. Genghis Khan's attitude towards sedentary civilization was complex and ultimately nihilistic. He and his commanders understood the value of cities as sources of wealth, skilled labor, and trade, yet they viewed the settled lifestyle with contempt and suspicion. Some of his advisors reportedly proposed that the entire agricultural population of northern China be exterminated and the land converted to pasture for Mongol herds. While this extreme proposal was not implemented, The consideration of such a policy reveals the fundamentally exploitative and ultimately destructive relationship the Mongols had with the civilizations they conquered. They wanted the products and wealth of settled societies, but felt no obligation to preserve the social structures or human populations that produced them. The Mongol administrative system in conquered territories reflected this attitude. While Genghis Khan eventually developed a relatively sophisticated system of governance, it was fundamentally extractive and maintained through fear. Local populations were subject to heavy taxation, with tax collectors empowered to use extreme violence to ensure compliance. Resistance to taxation or any perceived slight against Mongol authority could result in the execution of an entire village. Travel restrictions were imposed to prevent organization of resistance. In many regions, the population was disarmed, leaving them completely vulnerable to Mongol military forces and unable to defend themselves even against bandits or other threats. The postal and intelligence network developed by the Mongols, while often praised by historians for its efficiency, was also an instrument of control and oppression. Known as the Yam system, it required local populations to maintain stations where Mongol messengers could obtain fresh horses, food, and shelter. The burden of supporting this system fell heavily on conquered peoples, who had to provide these resources without compensation. More sinister was the intelligence function of the Yam. Informants and spies were cultivated throughout the empire, reporting any signs of discontent or rebellion. Those identified as potential troublemakers could be arrested and executed without trial. The constant surveillance created an atmosphere of paranoia and fear that was as effective as physical violence in maintaining control. Religious institutions and leaders were not spared from Mongol brutality when they posed obstacles to conquest or control. While Genghis Khan's policy toward religion was generally one of pragmatic tolerance, he understood that persecuting faith could spark rebellions. This tolerance evaporated when religious leaders opposed him or when religious sites stood in the way of military objectives. The destruction of mosques and madrasas in Central Asian cities was systematic and thorough. Not only were these buildings often demolished, but the religious scholars and clerics who staffed them were frequently killed, representing an incalculable loss of learning and cultural tradition. The targeting of religious institutions served multiple purposes in Mongol strategy. It demoralized populations by destroying spaces that held sacred significance and were centers of community life. It eliminated potential sources of organized resistance, as religious leaders often had the moral authority to rally opposition. And it demonstrated that the Mongols recognized no power higher than their own, that neither spiritual authority nor divine protection could save those who opposed them. In some cities, mosques and temples were deliberately converted into stables for Mongol horses, a calculated insult designed to humiliate defeated populations and demonstrate the supremacy of Mongol power over all competing sources of authority. The fate of the Nizari Ismailis, often called the Assassins, demonstrates how Genghis Khan's successors continued his policies of systematic extermination when faced with determined resistance. Though the final destruction of the Assassins occurred under Genghis Khan's grandson Hulagu, the policies and methods were those established by the great Khan himself. The Nizari strongholds in Persia, built in seemingly impregnable mountain locations, were besieged one by one. When they fell, the inhabitants, men, women, and children, were systematically killed. The famous library at Alamut, containing not only Ismaili religious texts, but also works on philosophy, science, and mathematics from across the Islamic world, was burned. Irreplaceable knowledge was lost forever in the flames. Another example of how Mongol conquest represented not just human tragedy, but cultural and intellectual devastation on a massive scale. Even those who submitted to Mongol rule were not necessarily safe. particularly if they were of high social status or potential political significance. Genghis Khan was deeply suspicious of anyone who might pose a future threat, and he had no qualms about eliminating potential rivals preventively. When the Merkit tribe was finally defeated, the entire aristocratic lineage was exterminated, including children and infants, to prevent any future claimant from emerging to challenge Mongol authority. This practice of killing the entire family line of defeated enemies was repeated across the empire. It represented a form of genocide, an attempt not merely to defeat an enemy, but to erase them completely from history. The betrayal and destruction of the Tatars, who had been enemies of Genghis Khan's tribe in his youth, illustrates this policy with particular clarity. After defeating them in battle, Genghis Khan ordered that all Tatar males taller than the linchpin of a cartwheel be executed. This meant that all adolescent and adult males were killed, while only young boys were allowed to live, and these survivors were distributed among Mongol families to be raised as Mongols. This was ethnic cleansing in its most literal sense, an attempt to destroy a people's cultural and genetic identity. The Tatar name survived only because it was ironically applied by outsiders to the Mongols themselves, a historical irony that the actual Tatars did not live to appreciate. The concept of collective responsibility was central to Mongol governance and military culture, and it led to atrocities that punished entire communities for the actions of individuals. If a village harbored rebels or failed to report their presence, the entire population might be executed. If troops from a particular region deserted or fought poorly, their home communities could face retaliation. This system ensured that communities policed themselves and that loyalty to the Mongols was enforced, not just by fear of direct punishment, but by fear of bringing destruction upon one's neighbors and family. It was social control through hostage-taking on a community-wide scale, and it was brutally effective. This collective responsibility extended to the Mongol military itself, where units of 10 were held collectively accountable for each member's actions. If one soldier fled in battle, his 9 comrades could be executed. This created a system of mutual surveillance and enforcement that made the Mongol army extraordinarily disciplined and reliable. But it also meant that warriors operated in an environment of constant fear and pressure. The same mechanisms that made the army effective also contributed to the systematic way in which atrocities were carried out. Soldiers who might have hesitated to commit mass murder were compelled to do so by the knowledge that refusal meant their own death and possibly that of their entire unit. The treatment of captured warriors varied depending on their perceived bravery and usefulness. Those who had fought with distinction were sometimes offered a choice: join the Mongol army and serve their conquerors, or die. Many chose service, and these turncoats became some of the most effective Mongol warriors, perhaps because they understood that demonstrating loyalty was now a matter of survival. Others, particularly those who had killed Mongol soldiers of high rank or who came from particularly hated enemy groups, faced torture and execution regardless of their combat prowess. The message was clear: brave resistance might earn respect, but would not earn mercy. Those who chose death over service often faced execution methods designed to deny them honor in death. Warriors from cultures that valued honorable combat death could be subjected to humiliating executions, being trampled by horses, drowned in rivers, or simply beaten to death with clubs rather than killed by weapons. The psychological cruelty of these methods lay in their denial of the warrior's identity and value. To die dishonorably was, for many martial cultures, worse than death itself, and the Mongols exploited this cultural vulnerability ruthlessly. These executions were often public, forcing communities and fellow warriors to witness the degradation of their heroes. The economic dimensions of Mongol conquest involved systematic plunder that went beyond simple looting. Entire economies were dismantled and their productive capacity shipped to Mongolia or other parts of the growing empire. Skilled craftsmen, metalworkers, silk weavers, jewelers, engineers were identified during the sorting of prisoners and forcibly relocated. These individuals would spend the rest of their lives as slaves, their skills exploited for Mongol benefit, while their families and communities were deprived of their knowledge and labor. This represented a form of economic warfare that weakened conquered territories and made future resistance more difficult by removing the human capital necessary for military and economic recovery. The long-term economic consequences of Mongol conquest were severe in many regions. The destruction of irrigation systems in Central Asia and Persia led to the collapse of agricultural productivity in areas that had supported dense populations for millennia. Cities that had been economic hubs for centuries were reduced to insignificant towns or abandoned entirely. Trade routes were disrupted for decades, and while the Mongols eventually facilitated trade across their empire, this came only after a period of destruction so complete that some regions never fully recovered. The opportunity cost, what these civilizations might have achieved if not destroyed, is incalculable, but certainly immense. The deliberate destruction of agricultural infrastructure in some regions appears to have been partly practical and partly ideological. Practically, destroying crops and irrigation systems denied resources to potential rebels and made the countryside impassable for enemy armies, while remaining passable for Mongol cavalry that could live off their herds. Ideologically, it reflected the Mongol preference for pastoral nomadism over settled agriculture. In northern China and parts of Central Asia, there is evidence that Mongol administrators seriously considered abandoning agriculture entirely in favor of converting land to pasture. While this extreme policy was not fully implemented, the consideration reveals the fundamental contempt with which the Mongols viewed the settled lifestyle that most of their subjects depended upon. Genghis Khan's legal code, the Yasa, is often praised by historians for bringing a degree of order to the vast Mongol empire. However, the Yasa itself prescribed horrifically disproportionate punishments for many offenses. Adultery was punishable by death. Theft of livestock could result in execution, and in some cases, the execution of the thief's entire family. Religious practices that offended Mongol sensibilities, such as the ritual slaughter of animals according to Islamic law, could be punished severely. The Yasa's enforcement was arbitrary and absolute, with local commanders often interpreting its provisions to justify extreme violence. There was no appeal, no judicial review, and no mercy for those convicted of violations. The law applied differently to Mongols and to conquered subjects, creating a two-tiered system that institutionalized the supremacy of the conquerors. A Mongol who killed a subject might face minimal punishment or none at all, while a subject who harmed a Mongol faced death, often along with family members. This legal inequality was deliberate and fundamental to Mongol governance. It ensured that the subject populations understood their inferior status and that Mongols felt empowered to use violence to maintain control. The system was designed to be oppressive, to create and maintain a clear hierarchy where the conquered lived in constant fear of their conquerors. Women in conquered territories faced particular vulnerabilities under Mongol rule. Beyond the immediate violence of conquest, they lived in a legal system that offered them minimal protection against sexual exploitation or violence from Mongol soldiers and administrators. Complaints by conquered peoples about the treatment of their women were generally ignored or punished. The systematic taking of women as concubines and slaves was not merely tolerated, but was considered a right of conquest. Families that attempted to hide their daughters faced execution if discovered. The social fabric of conquered societies was thus systematically torn apart, with women treated as spoils of war and family bonds subordinated to the desires of the conquerors. The use of terror as a governing tool did not end with Genghis Khan's conquests. It continued to be employed throughout his reign and by his successors. Rebellions were met with exemplary violence designed to discourage future uprisings. When the city of Herat in modern Afghanistan rebelled against Mongol rule in 1221, after having initially surrendered, the reprisals were catastrophic. The city was besieged, recaptured, and then subjected to a massacre that reportedly lasted a week. The population, which had numbered over 100,000, was reduced to approximately 40 people, according to some accounts. Even allowing for exaggeration, the scale of killing was immense. The message was clear: initial surrender was not enough. Absolute and perpetual obedience was demanded, and any wavering would be met with annihilation. These reprisal massacres served a strategic purpose. They demonstrated that Genghis Khan's reach was long and his memory unforgiving. Cities that had surrendered but later rebelled faced worse fates than those that had initially resisted because they had violated the implicit contract of submission. This policy ensured that once a city surrendered, its population had every incentive to remain compliant, as they knew that rebellion would bring not just defeat, but extermination. It was a system of control through hostage-taking on a civilizational scale, where entire populations were held accountable for the loyalty of their communities. The environmental consequences of Mongol conquest are sometimes overlooked, but were significant and lasting. The destruction of irrigation systems, the conversion of agricultural land to pasture, and the depopulation of vast regions had ecological effects that persisted for centuries. In some areas, the disruption was so complete that the landscape itself changed. Forests reclaimed areas that had been cleared for agriculture. Desertification increased in regions where irrigation networks were destroyed. The Mongol conquests represented not just a human catastrophe, but an environmental one, altering the physical geography of conquered territories in ways that affected the lives of countless generations that followed. The psychological trauma inflicted on conquered populations was profound and intergenerational. Communities that survived Mongol conquest carried the memory of the atrocities forward, and these memories shaped cultures and societies in lasting ways. The fear of the Mongols became so deeply embedded in collective consciousness that it influenced political decisions, military strategies, and social organization for generations. In some regions, the memory of Mongol brutality was used by rulers to justify authoritarian measures, arguing that only strong, centralized control could prevent a repeat of the catastrophe. The legacy of terror thus extended far beyond the immediate victims, shaping the historical trajectory of entire civilizations. Genghis Khan's personal involvement in and approval of these atrocities cannot be minimized or excused by historical context. While the 13th century was undoubtedly a violent time and warfare was often brutal, the scale, systematic nature, and deliberate policy of terror employed by Genghis Khan stood out even among contemporaries. Other rulers of the period, while certainly capable of cruelty, did not implement industrial-scale massacre as a routine tool of statecraft. The calculated nature of Mongol atrocities, the careful planning, the systematic execution, the deliberate use of terror for strategic purposes, marks them as qualitatively different from the violence common to the era. Contemporary chroniclers, even those from cultures accustomed to warfare and conquest, expressed horror at Mongol methods. Persian historians like Rashid al-Din, writing in the service of Mongol rulers and thus with incentive to present them favorably, nevertheless recorded the devastating impact of the conquests. Chinese sources documented the population collapse in northern China. European chroniclers described the Mongol advance into Eastern Europe with apocalyptic language, seeing in the Mongols a divine punishment or a force of nature rather than a conventional army. This widespread recognition across cultures suggests that even by the standards of a violent age, Mongol methods were extreme and shocking. The question of Genghis Khan's moral responsibility for these atrocities is complicated by questions of historical agency and cultural relativism, but ultimately unavoidable. He personally ordered many of the massacres, designed the policies that made them routine, and created the military and administrative systems that carried them out. His commanders acted with his authority and in accordance with his strategic vision. While individual soldiers committed the actual killings, they did so within a framework designed and imposed from the top. Genghis Khan was not a distant figurehead, but an active participant in conquest, present at many sieges and personally involved in strategic and policy decisions. Some modern historians have attempted to rehabilitate Genghis Khan's reputation, emphasizing his role in facilitating trade, his religious tolerance, his meritocratic administration, and his creation of a legal code. While these aspects of his reign are real and historically significant, they cannot erase or mitigate the horror of his conquests. The Pax Mongolica, the period of relative peace and prosperity within the Mongol Empire, was built on the foundation of millions of corpses and the systematic terrorization of populations across 2 continents. The positive aspects of Mongol rule came after and were purchased through atrocities of staggering scale. There is a tendency in popular culture to romanticize Genghis Khan as a brilliant strategist and visionary leader, while minimizing or ignoring the human cost of his achievements. This tendency reflects a broader problem in how we engage with historical violence, a willingness to be impressed by success and scale while abstracting away the suffering of victims. The numbers involved, millions dead, cities erased, civilizations disrupted, are so large that they become incomprehensible, statistical rather than human. Each individual victim had thoughts, feelings, loved ones, dreams, and fears. Each experienced terror and pain. The aggregation into massive death tolls risks dehumanizing the victims and obscuring the reality of what occurred. The genetic legacy mentioned earlier, the millions of descendants, is sometimes presented in popular accounts as a testament to Genghis Khan's virility and success. This framing is deeply problematic. Those descendants are not primarily the result of consensual relationships, but of systematic sexual violence, coercion, and the exploitation of enslaved women. Every descendant represents an ancestral line that began with rape or coerced concubinage. This is not a legacy to celebrate, but to acknowledge soberly as evidence of systematic sexual violence on a scale rarely seen in history. The genetic evidence is a biological record of atrocity, not achievement. Understanding these atrocities requires grappling with uncomfortable questions about human nature, power, and the ease with which ordinary people can be organized to commit extraordinary evil. The Mongol soldiers who filled mass graves with bodies, who drove prisoners ahead of them as shields, who systematically raped and enslaved women, were not monsters in the sense of being fundamentally different from other humans. They were men shaped by their culture, trained in specific ways, and placed within institutional structures that rewarded brutality and punished mercy. This is perhaps more disturbing than the alternative, because it suggests that the capacity for such evil is not rare, but latent, waiting to be activated by the right combination of culture, leadership, and circumstances. The Mongol conquests also raise questions about the relationship between military effectiveness and moral conduct. The Mongol army was extraordinarily effective, perhaps the most effective military force in history relative to its size and technological level. This effectiveness was partly due to factors we might consider admirable: discipline, organization, training, logistics, and tactical innovation. But it was also due to the systematic use of terror, the willingness to commit atrocities that other armies would not, and the complete subordination of moral considerations to strategic objectives. The Mongol example suggests that military effectiveness and moral restraint may sometimes be in tension, a troubling realization that complicates easy assumptions about the nature of warfare. The scale of killing during Genghis Khan's conquests has been compared by some scholars to 20th century genocides. The comparison is complex because the Mongols did not target groups based on ethnic or religious identity in the way that defines modern genocide. Rather, they targeted populations based on resistance to conquest. Those who submitted were generally spared, those who resisted were annihilated. However, the effect in many cases was the effective destruction of entire ethnic groups, cultures, and civilizations. The Khwarezmian civilization, for example, never recovered from the Mongol invasion. The population and cultural destruction was so complete that the region's demographic and cultural character was fundamentally altered. Estimates of total deaths from Genghis Khan's conquests vary widely, but even conservative estimates place the number in the tens of millions. Some scholars suggest that the global population declined during the period of Mongol expansion, a rare occurrence in history generally characterized by population growth. The demographic impact was most severe in the regions of heaviest conquest: Central Asia, Persia, and northern China. In these regions, population levels may not have recovered to pre-conquest levels for centuries. This represents not just immediate killing, but the long-term impact of destroyed infrastructure, disrupted societies, and economic collapse that made recovery difficult even for surviving populations. The cultural and intellectual losses from Mongol conquest are incalculable. Libraries burned, cities that were centers of learning destroyed, entire scholarly lineages wiped out. The Mongol invasions represented one of the greatest destructions of accumulated knowledge and cultural achievement in human history. Works of literature, philosophy, science, and history that had survived for centuries were lost forever. Artistic traditions were disrupted or destroyed. The continuity of civilizations that had existed for millennia was severed. While some knowledge survived, either because it had been widely distributed or because it was later reconstructed, the loss is nonetheless immense. We can never know what insights, discoveries, or artistic achievements might have emerged from the civilizations that were destroyed, or what knowledge was lost when libraries burned and scholars were killed. In the city of Baghdad, though its destruction occurred after Genghis Khan's death and was carried out by his grandson Hulagu, the template established by the Great Khan was followed to devastating effect. The Abbasid Caliphate, one of the great centers of Islamic civilization and learning, was obliterated in 1258. The House of Wisdom, one of the greatest libraries in the medieval world, was destroyed. Accounts describe the Tigris River running black with ink from the enormous number of books thrown into it, then running red with the blood of the city's inhabitants. Scholars estimate that hundreds of thousands died in the sack of Baghdad. The destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate marked the effective end of the Islamic Golden Age and represented a cultural catastrophe whose effects are still felt in the Islamic world today. The environmental impact of these conquests extended to human ecology as well. The massive death tolls and population movements altered settlement patterns, disease vectors, and economic relationships across Eurasia. Some scholars have suggested that the Mongol conquests, by creating unprecedented connectivity across Eurasia through the Pax Mongolica, may have facilitated the transmission of the Black Death in the 14th century. The same trade routes that allowed silk, spices, and ideas to flow also allowed the plague to spread with devastating effect. If this hypothesis is correct, then the Mongol legacy includes not just the millions who died during conquest, but additional millions who died from diseases that spread along the routes the Mongols had established. Genghis Khan's death in 1227, possibly from injuries sustained in a fall from a horse, did not end the atrocities committed in his name. His sons and grandsons continued his policies of conquest and systematic violence, expanding the empire even further. The campaigns in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and southern China that followed his death employed the same methods of terror and massacre that he had established. In some ways, his legacy was perpetuated not despite his death, but because of the systems he had created. The Mongol Empire became a machine for conquest that could operate independently of any single leader, its methods and culture self-perpetuating across generations. The tradition of secrecy surrounding Genghis Khan's burial site, a secret maintained through the execution of everyone involved in the funeral procession, is itself a final atrocity associated with his life. According to tradition, hundreds or thousands of people were killed to preserve the location of his tomb. This sacrifice of lives for symbolic purposes reflects the same disregard for human life that characterized his conquests. The living were expendable in service to the dead Khan's legacy, just as millions had been expendable in service to his ambitions during life. Even in death, he demanded the ultimate price from those around him. The historical memory of Genghis Khan varies dramatically across cultures, reflecting the different experiences of peoples during the Mongol conquests. In Mongolia, he is celebrated as a national hero, the founder of the Mongol nation and empire. His image appears on currency, monuments, and commercial products. This veneration is understandable from a nationalistic perspective, but is deeply troubling when it minimizes or ignores the suffering caused by his campaigns. In contrast, in many regions that were conquered, Iran, Central Asia, parts of China, the memory of Mongol conquest is associated with catastrophe and trauma. These divergent memories reflect a fundamental question. How do we remember historical figures who were both architects of great empires and perpetrators of great atrocities? The lessons of Genghis Khan's conquests remain relevant today. They demonstrate how effective leadership, organizational innovation, and strategic brilliance can be placed in service of evil ends. They show how systematic terror can be used as a tool of governance and control. They illustrate the ease with which ordinary people can be organized to commit extraordinary atrocities when placed within the right institutional structures and cultural frameworks. And they demonstrate the lasting impact that such violence can have, not just on immediate victims, but on the trajectory of entire civilizations for centuries. There is no redemptive ending to the story of Genghis Khan's atrocities. The dead remain dead, the destroyed civilizations remained destroyed, and the trauma rippled forward through generations. The Pax Mongolica that eventually emerged brought benefits, increased trade, cultural exchange, and a degree of administrative efficiency. But these came at a cost so terrible that it is difficult to argue they justified the means. Millions of lives, countless cultural achievements, and the peaceful development of civilizations were sacrificed to create an empire that, like all empires, eventually fragmented and fell. In confronting the reality of Genghis Khan's actions, we must resist the temptation to look away or to rationalize atrocity as merely a product of its time. While historical context is important for understanding, it cannot serve as excuse or justification. What Genghis Khan and his armies did was evil by any reasonable moral standard, past or present. The systematic massacre of civilian populations, the deliberate use of terror, the mass sexual violence, the destruction of cultural and intellectual heritage, these are acts that demand condemnation, not the moral equivocation that often characterizes discussions of historical violence. Yet we must also resist the temptation to view Genghis Khan and the Mongols as uniquely monstrous, as fundamentally different from other humans. They were people shaped by their circumstances, making choices within their cultural and historical context. The disturbing truth is that humans, given the right circumstances, cultures, and institutions, are capable of extraordinary evil. The Mongol conquests are not anomalous, but rather represent an extreme example of a capacity for violence that exists within human nature and human societies. Understanding this is essential not to excuse what happened, but to recognize the conditions that allow such atrocities to occur and to work against their recurrence. The historical record of Genghis Khan's conquests stands as one of the darkest chapters in human history. The death toll, measured in the millions or tens of millions, represents suffering on a scale difficult to comprehend. Behind each number was a person who experienced fear, pain, and death. Behind each destroyed city was a community with its own history, culture, and aspirations. The legacy of these conquests shaped the development of entire regions for centuries, altering the course of human history through violence and terror. In remembering Genghis Khan, we must remember not just the empire he built, but the human cost at which it was built. A cost paid by millions of victims whose names history has forgotten, but whose suffering should not be erased by time or by the impressive scale of their conquerors' achievements.